From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Carolyn Brown, Director of the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center. And it is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Dr. Louis Galambos, holder of the Cary and Ann Maguire Chair in American History and Ethics here at the Kluge Center, who will be talking to us about business and history. Dr. Galambos is Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. He's taught at Rice and Rutgers and Yale, served as a president of the Business History Conference and the Economic History Association, former editor of the Journal of Economic History. Dr. Galambos has written extensively, and I do mean extensively, on U.S. business history, business-government relations, the economic aspects of modern institutional development in America, and the rise of the bureaucratic state. Particularly interesting to talk to him about bureaucracies. He also has a very strong interest in the process of innovation in public and private organizations, and a large number of publications in that area. As I was doing some background for this introduction, I looked at another area which I found particularly fascinating. Dr. Galambos has been a very productive editor in his field, and one of his particular accomplishments is something I think is very indicative of his approach to scholarship and certainly to editing. And this is the massive project he did to edit the papers of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The project began in the mid-60s and resulted in a massive 21-volume publication of Eisenhower's personal papers, diaries, letters, etc. Must be quite a thing to hold. When Lou became editor-in-chief in the early 70s, he decided that it would be completed by the turn of the century, by 2000. And in fact, when the clock struck, I'd be a little dramatic, on New Year's Eve in 2000, the project was virtually finished and at the publishers. And people who know this kind of work, I'm told, were totally astonished. It's unheard of to actually set an end and get to it, complete it, have it done, and then go on to the next thing. And I can testify, when Lou has been here, we sort of pay attention to who's here and how often they come and whatnot. And he's here. He really is. This afternoon, he's turning his attention to other matters. We all have been reading in the newspapers about business ethics and lack of business ethics. And I probably suspect that you, with me, have wondered why we make such a fuss about it. And then when you look at what happens as follow-up, not as much happens as one would expect from the amount of fuss that gets made about it. Dr. Galambos is going to shed some light, I hope, on this issue. I don't know about any hope, but some light. So please join me in welcoming Lou Galambos.
Thanks for the kind introduction. And since I'm supposed to be interested in ethics as part of my chair, that includes truth in advertising. And so I should also add to the thing they always leave out of the introduction. I once left a university on probation, having failed, among other things, organic chemistry. I was reformed by the U.S. Navy, which you don't probably identify with reform, but they reformed me, and I did better at the next two schools that took me to graduate. I went to 3 universities before I finally graduated. You should also know, as truth in advertising, that the Wall Street Journal, being the Wall Street Journal, okay, that should click. The Wall Street Journal used this title, Business and History, for an op-ed that I wrote. So I've put copies of the op-ed up here, and if anyone wants them, they can pick that up, okay? It's not very long. It's not like the volumes of the Eisenhower papers, which are chest crushers. If you try to read them in bed at night, you know those kind of books, like 1,000 pages, boom, they come down when you fall asleep. So at any rate, that's a short piece. I also have a visual, my powerless point. This is as far as I've gone toward PowerPoint, okay? That's my visual contribution. I don't do anything mechanical while I'm teaching. I won't even put up a Venetian blind. I did that once and produced 7 or 8 minutes of humor in my class. They were laughing at me, so I won't do that. Now, what these are is what I believe, after having spent about 50 years studying it, are the most important things that most of us want out of a business system. They're the things that we want out of any kind of economy. And that's whether it's capitalist or socialist or communist or some combination, which is what most of us have most of the time. We want equity. That is, we want fairness. We want to have some sense that the system is just. Now, frequently, this involves, when we think about it, our sense about the way power and income and wealth, and they are different, the way power and income and wealth are distributed. Okay, so every time the government does it officially, and it does it officially fairly often, we get the 5 divisions of our economy. Okay, and that is there'll be 5 divisions in terms of income and also the distribution of wealth. And what we're worried about is the bottom and the top. We don't worry much about the middle. The one thing you should know about those distributions is they're static. They don't tell you anything about what happened between here and here, except that the percentages change. So what we don't know, and what's the crucial thing, I think, and we'll get to this later, is who moved from here to here, and who moved from here to here, or here to here, or here to here, and who moved down. Okay? So those measures, but they always make the front page of the New York Times and the Washington Post when they come out, because we're very sensitive and we're very worried about the way these things are distributed. Frequently, our sense of our desire for equity is reflected in our desire for transparency. We want to know how much they make, okay, at the top, and how little they make at the bottom. We want to know. We want transparency. We'd like to know how things are done, how power is exercised. Okay, we know a lot more, okay, by the end of the 20th century and early 21st century about all of these things, okay, than anyone did in the 19th century. But we're not finished, all right? We still want to know more. So we want a very high degree of transparency. And that's one of the things we try to measure about societies when we try to compare them. We try to compare them in terms of their degree of transparency. How much do people know about how these things are done? Frequently and recently, okay, our desire for equity is reflected in our sense of outrage. We can be outraged as we are, I think, as a society, when we see incidents like the Enron scandal, okay? There's been a lot of this, all right? It's on the front pages all of the time. A whole series, a burst. It seems like we're being surrounded by corporate scandals and problems in our society. This really bothers us, particularly when we put it together with what we've been reading lately, because it has become known, okay, about CEO pay, okay? We read about how much these people make, particularly when it's in a court case. We learn about how much they're getting, and we start to compare that with what we get, okay? And that really is irritating, particularly because in the last 20 to 30 years, it seems to have shot sort of into the stratosphere, someplace where we can't really imagine, we can't think about it. It's like the multi-billion-dollar deals. I don't know about you, but I have my trouble getting my mind around $1 billion. I know there are people who don't. Bill Gates has no trouble with this at all. He counts them $1 billion at a time, 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, but I have a lot of trouble with billions. And when I see a 21 or a 28 or a 38 or 48, 58, 78 multi-billion-dollar deal, I get worried, okay? And particularly when I see the percentages that you get on commission when you complete one of these deals, okay? My home state, I live in Baltimore, the state of Maryland is now in great turmoil over the effort to combine two of the energy companies, Constellation Energy truth in advertising. Again, my daughter is an attorney for, one of my oldest daughters, an attorney for Constellation Energy, and anything I say from this point on should be with an asterisk on it, all right? Okay, I can't say much, but there is a great flap over the price of energy and over the way it's connected to a recent deal combining a Florida energy company with Constellation. So we get really worried about this, and I think there's been a sense of outrage in our society. But we don't only want equity, we also want a measure of economic security. We all want a certain amount of security. We want protection from sudden change. We want to know that the society is some way going to take care of people who are ill, people who are old, the angle of incidence on my forehead is what measures the years, and you can see that from the side. But we want to know about that, all right? We want to know that the system will provide jobs on a fairly regular basis, okay? They might be jobs that last, all right, for some time, okay? We don't like the insecurity that goes with change. Some of us want economic opportunities. We want the system to generate economic opportunities. And again, we want those things to happen regularly for us, and we don't want it to suddenly change. We want some reasonable stability. I work in a university, Johns Hopkins University, and I would like to know that next week it's not going to be bankrupt and go out of business, or send me a note and say I'm not going to get a paycheck this month because they didn't do their accounting correctly, okay? Now I would be really upset by that. So would my creditors. I have a marvelous institution. I have tenure in a university. What an unusual thing. They can only fire me if I do certain gross things, and even then they would hesitate, and when someone does them, and we have had deans who do them, we never have professors who do them, we have had people who do them, it's hard to even fire those people, okay, because they're worried about court cases. Tenure is a marvelous institution, but I won't go on about that, all right? But so it reflects the desire for a certain measure of stability and security in our lives, and seems to be a perfectly reasonable thing and a very natural thing for people to want that. At the same time, we want the system to innovate. We want to have an economic system that innovates, that changes. We all want new products and services, okay? We may not want them right now, but we're going to want them at some point. We want new things. If you're one of my students, you don't just want a cell phone. I have a cell phone which I forgot to turn off, okay? But look at it. It's got a piece of Scotch tape holding the aerial, all right? There isn't a single one of my students that would carry this. They'd be scorned in the university if they carried anything around like this, an ancient old cell phone. They all have really nifty things that they go whoosh, like that, and they pop open, you know. They look great. Probably some of you have those too, okay? So we want those things, okay? If you're one of my older daughters, you just can't exist without a BlackBerry. She does business all of the time, okay? And as an eminent lawyer told me just recently, wow, he said, I can do my business standing in line at Disney World. It made me almost throw up, okay? Yeah, sure, I know, he's connected 24 hours a day through his BlackBerry. Well, we all want that, or not all of us, but some of us want that, okay? So we want new things, and if you work for a company, we want the company to innovate. If you're in the private sector, even in the nonprofit sector, we want universities to change. When the fields change, we want them to change. Okay? Now, universities are funny institutions. They're very important in our society. Professors, the professoriate in the university is extremely liberal, maybe even radical about the government. But if you try to change housing, where their offices are, if you try to change their parking, or you try to change the schedule of the university and therefore their lectures, you are in for a storm of resistance. We had a president who withdrew a rescheduling change in 24 hours, okay? That's how long it took for the faculty to get through to him, all right? So all of these things are extremely important to us, okay? So we want change of certain kinds, and we're opposed to change of other kinds. Now, one of the great problems in the modern society has been with central systems. Central systems have problems with innovation. They're creaky, bureaucratic. The myths about bureaucracy are actually founded on real experience, okay? They have a hard time changing, adjusting. People who want consumer goods changed all the time. When I think about central systems and how they can control an economic system, I always think about, I have little daughters. I have two sets of daughters. One's a lawyer, I already told you. One's a head of middle school. Then I have one who's 8 and one who's 6. Okay? So I'm in touch with Polly Pockets. Not many of you know about Polly Pockets. A few know about Polly Pockets. Well, I often think of how hard it would be for a 75-year-old executive in the central administration to decide that society needed Polly Pockets. It's a little doll, and it came in a great wave, okay, mostly from China. A little doll that comes with all elaborate sets, Polly Pockets on the beach, Polly Pockets dresses up, Polly Pockets goes to a dance, everything. But once they caught, everybody in middle school, in lower school, had to have Polly Pockets. And I know this because they all have birthday parties, and that's what I buy for them, endless numbers of Polly Pockets. So they make them in all forms. The newest one is Crocs. Any of you have Crocs? They're these incredibly ugly rubber shoes. But it was announced by my 8-year-old, the famous line all fathers have had, everybody has them, Dad, everybody. And then she listed them. Abby has them, yeah, Zoe has them, all of them. She listed the whole list, and pounded away at me for 2 weeks and then got them, okay? You know how that works, all right? So we want innovation, all right, and we want things to change. At the same time, we want efficiency in the operation of our economic system. We want a measure of efficiency. That's in public institutions, in private institutions, and even in nonprofit institutions. We want them to be reasonably efficient. We get awfully impatient when they aren't, okay? Some of you have gone overseas, all of you have probably gone overseas, okay? And experienced, okay, systems that move a little slower than our grocery stores, okay? Or our drug stores or other institutions. And we get nervous, okay? The first time you go into the deep south, okay, in America, if you're from the Northeast, you get very impatient when you're waiting for something to happen. You start drumming your fingers, and then somebody tells you that's irritating. Stop that, will you please? Okay? But if you're used to moving things along in a kind of Northeastern fashion, you get very impatient with that. Even with the way people speak, it seems to take a long time sometimes to finish a sentence. We get awfully impatient with that. We want things to be efficient, okay? And in the private sector, certainly, but also in the other sectors, we want to be able to deal effectively with competition. So we want to know that our institutions are efficient enough to deal with the competition they face. Now, these 4 goals are embedded in our political ideologies and in our histories, okay? The liberal version of American history has emphasized the search for equity and security. Those have been major themes in liberal or progressive history. Most of our most powerful historical syntheses in the 19th and 20th century have emphasized the search for equity and security, generally in capitalist systems, okay? So they've been central themes in the history and extremely important. The Fox channel today emphasizes innovation and efficiency, as does my favorite journal, the Wall Street Journal, okay, emphasizes innovation and efficiency. Most economists, most business historians, most economic historians, when they write, they emphasize not equity, okay, and not security, but efficiency and innovation. Now, my point today is that we clearly cannot maximize on all of these goals. You cannot maximize on all 4 of these goals at the same time, okay? If you have complete security, all right? Complete security, no change, okay? No one is going to have their life changed, all right? Nothing would change. You're not going to have any innovation in the system, okay? And you're probably going to have, over time, a loss of efficiency, all right? So you're going to have to get a balance somehow between these objectives. Okay, And that's what we struggle with, it seems to me. So we have trade-offs all of the time. And I would suggest that every society achieves and then alters over time the balance between these four major goals, okay? America is no exception, although I think our balance is unusual historically, okay? Now, I think individuals also do the same thing. We balance risk, okay? We think, well, if there's a whole lot of innovation and change in that, there's also a whole lot of risk. I want a higher measure of security than that. When we choose our professions or our occupations, we're often thinking about this without thinking it through very systematically. But we achieve a balance between the things we want, okay, in life and how they fit with that. Now, how does society achieve a balance? How does society go about doing this? Well, one way that society gets a balance is with markets, okay? We use markets. Most Americans have, for most of our history, been willing to let markets make a large number of decisions about the proper balance between equity, security, innovation, and efficiency, okay? So we have been a very market-oriented society right from the beginning, okay? And it has been extremely important in our history, and you can always ask that same question, why did we do that, okay? And we'll get back to that. Now, we've never allowed markets to decide everything, okay? There's always been a balance, all right? And especially in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, large numbers of Americans became really concerned about equity, very concerned about equity in our society. Too much power, too much wealth were being concentrated in too few hands, and we didn't trust the hands, okay? We wanted to know, particularly when people like William Vanderbilt said, being confronted with the public being upset about what the railroad was doing, he said, memorably, "The public be damned." Now, after they say that, okay, you don't really trust them, okay? Or we trust them to do the wrong thing, okay? We had built great fortunes, enormous fortunes. You can go visit the houses now. My favorite is the Vanderbilt Mansion up in New York, because it has that gilt room. Any of you visited the Vanderbilt Mansion, seen the gilt? It's all gold. It's a room all in gold gilt, okay? It's really gross, okay? You get a real feel for what those fortunes persuaded people to do, you know. It was the same thing with the Rockefellers. We were really nervous about the way they exercised their power. If you were a competitor of the Rockefeller Empire and he got a rebate on your business, yeah, he got a rebate when you shipped oil over the railroad. That's power. Okay, you got a rebate on somebody else's business. Okay, that's just a subsidy, okay, and it reflects an unbelievable amount of power that a great monopoly, it controlled 90% of the oil supply of the United States. 90% at one time, that was a peak before Spindletop came in. Okay, so we were very worried about that. And there were at that time great waves of corruption in the business system. We had experienced very rapid growth. The United States had become, in the 1890s, the world's leading industrial power, and had become that very quickly, okay, from a very low base in the early part of the century, all right? And things were changing very rapidly. We seemed to be breaking down local communities, governments, and values that had limited corruption in a commercial agrarian society. There was a tremendous amount of corporate corruption at that time. So we turned to what? To regulation and taxation as a means of bringing the system under control. There were waves of legislative action in the populist, progressive, and New Deal eras, and they were all aimed at making our system more just and providing a measure of security. During the New Deal, for instance, Social Security, all right? We were more than 40 years behind the Germans and a little bit less than that behind the British, okay? But we finally got Social Security, which we still have today. We got the administrative state in a virtually stateless society at the national level. Now, much later, we began to notice that minorities and women were not treated fairly, equity, okay? It took a long time to realize that. During the New Deal, we didn't notice that very much, okay? We didn't mind driving sharecroppers off the land, okay? Because we had to get a new system to control prices, all right? So once again, it seemed to me, in the post-war period, we turned to using government to achieve a better balance. One of the products of this effort over the 20th century was what's called the Independent Regulatory Commission, okay, which we still have many today. That's an agency that Americans hoped would be independent of political manipulation. It's not, but they hoped it would be, okay, and independent of influence by those being regulated. That's also not true, but we hoped it would be, okay? So we created agencies. Some of them ran well, some of them ran poorly. The ICC was probably the poorest of all of them. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, that's been important recently, was probably the best, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we used markets to try to get a balance, and we used government to try to improve that balance. And I always tell my students that if you're really dedicated to markets and you think that's the only way to do things, remember, there's a market for 14-year-old kids. Yes, all around the world there's a market for kids. All right, do you want that market to exist? Are you willing to let everything in the hands of a market? No, obviously not, okay? So we had to get a balance. One of the other ways to achieve a balance was through the professions. Everybody in this room probably is either a member of a profession or aspires to be or could be. And the commissions, for instance, in our society turned to another group of Americans, and that was the professions that could provide the expertise they needed, okay? Now, professions are important and interesting institutions. We have an enormous number of them, and most of them were products of the period from 1890 to the present. Most of them were new, all right? They didn't exist in the early part of the 19th century. And they're interesting for several reasons. They exercise power. They influence income and thus wealth. And they largely regulate themselves, which is very interesting. They largely regulate themselves. They're supposed to be ethical because they're a profession. Now, I'm somewhat skeptical about this myself. Okay, I know intimately the story of a history department at a great university just to the north of us. I'll remain unnamed, in which the faculty voted to double the workload of the graduate students. They hadn't asked them. They didn't bother to tell them until it was finished, but they doubled their workload. Okay. Now, if that had happened at General Motors, it would have been on the front page of every newspaper in the country, okay? The battle would have been on, and General Motors would have lost, okay? The history department won quietly. Nobody said anything. There was no ethical concern, okay? And there was only one vote against it, all right? Well, we had to, they said. We need more teaching, cheap teaching. Well, they didn't use cheap. They just said more teaching, okay? These kinds of experiences have left me somewhat skeptical about professional ethics. But nonetheless, we depend to a great extent upon ethical behavior on the part of the profession. We have large numbers of them. We have traditional and solidly established professions, law, medicine, the clergy, maybe engineering, more recently science, and many others. And we have organizational professions, those who can only practice within their organizations. And then we have quasi-professions, those who aspire to be professionals but don't quite make it, okay? For instance, public relations is a good example of something. Management consulting is another, where they aspired to be professionals but didn't quite make it over the hump, you know? Didn't quite make it to having an independent source of power. Now, where do businessmen and women fit in this array? Many in business staff positions are recruited from the traditional and solidly established professions, science, engineering, medicine, law. They serve the corporation, work within the corporation, but have an independent position. Most of those in business in what are called line positions, that's where all the money is and the power, okay? Staff is staff to the line. Line is authority, okay? They tell the people, okay, what are called their direct reports, what to do, and their direct reports tell their direct reports tell their direct reports, and on and on and on down to the shop floor, okay? Line authority is very seldom professional in any sense except organizational professions. They haven't received society's grant of status and of self-regulation in the same way. We might ask why. Well, my answer is that we want a great deal of innovation and efficiency out of them, and their organizations, in particular, are not concerned with equity and security. They're very, very skeptical about equity and security, although they may talk a good game because they have public relations staff members who tell them what to say. They will never say the public be damned. Okay, that'll never get out. They may think that, but they'll never say that, okay, because they pay people a lot of money to help them say, it's called staff drafted, okay, to produce staff drafted speeches, okay. But in business organizations, all right, if you are really strongly in favor of security and equity, you're going to have a lot of trouble with innovation and efficiency over the long run, and you know that. Now, with these concepts in mind, I want to briefly go back to Enron and our recent scandals. Well, what happened? Well, we experienced very rapid growth. I already mentioned that. Very rapid growth. We experienced new technologies, okay? This is the information age. Sudden change in technologies. The old second industrial revolution concepts of great vertically integrated horizontal combinations began to give way. These companies began to fracture. We had new technologies. We had a new wave of wealth and income. My favorite stories is from San Francisco, where Silicon Valley produced a great deal of this. And you got to imagine this. It's a cocktail party. There's a woman of about 60 years old and a young man who's about 35. And she turns to him and says, he had just sold his company. And I think he had made $40 million at the age of 35. She said, "Don't you feel guilty?" And he rears up, and he says, "I put in 6 years of hard work on that," okay, and felt very, very just, okay, about having his multi-millions, all right. He had worked hard for that, okay. Well, we had this great wave of wealth, and we had products like Enron. Now, Enron was an innovator, okay? Enron was an innovative company. It was successful, enormously successful for a time. Many people don't actually know what Enron did. How many of you don't know what Enron did to be successful? I was honest at the beginning of the lecture. Okay, put them way up, okay? Okay, it dealt in energy. It dealt in energy, okay? It entered energy markets and achieved a very strong position in those markets and facilitated exchange and transfer, okay, of products and services in those markets, all right? And that worked all right as long as it was in a narrow range of markets, okay, where it could exercise influence. And then it began to expand beyond that and got into a lot of trouble. Began to try to do everything. If it could do oil and natural gas, maybe it could do coal. Maybe it could do this. And there were those barges that we've read about, okay? What were they doing dealing in those barges, you know? So they began to expand. Then they got into trouble, and that's when the firm's leaders made mistakes for which they have paid a price. They ran into deep trouble. Now, what happened with Enron, and it's typical of all of these experiences, we had a professional breakdown. The professions of accounting broke down, okay? And that's because they had combined with management consulting, and we have one accountant in the room, I know, a man who teaches accounting at a distinguished university, but the accounting profession broke down, lost its sense of values, okay, because it became entwined with management consulting, so it was on both sides. It was telling people, this is okay because we told you to do it, okay? That's bad. All right, you can't be the judge and the prosecuting attorney at the same time. All right, and that's what happened. So we had a professional breakdown. We had a regulatory breakdown. The Securities and Exchange Commission, that had run so well, I said, for a long time, broke down. and was not really able to do it. Particularly when you have rapid expansion and change, it's hard for these agencies to regulate. And we had a market breakdown. The market failed to read the signals. The market didn't know. There wasn't much transparency. They fooled them. The market failed to respond quickly to the crisis. But don't give up hope, okay? Don't give up hope. The market did respond, and the firm went into bankruptcy. That's a market response, okay? The firm failed, okay? The regulatory and supporting judicial system did respond, and among other things, it sent people to jail for what they had done, okay? We've had a response. We also changed the regulatory system, okay, to try to prevent this sort of problem from developing. But what we didn't do is also important. We didn't change our system of political economy. Now, why? Well, the answer is the same one that was true with the earlier waves of corruption, and it will be true, I think, in the next wave of corruption. Okay? My answer is that the system has continued to generate enough innovation and enough efficiency to enable most of us to put its shortcomings in producing equity and security out of mind after there's a response. When there's a response, it makes us feel better about the system, and as long as it's producing, generating that income, and as long as those unemployment figures are as low as they are, okay, then we'll go on accepting that. We're still a society in which motion, change, helping some, hurting others. In Europe, it's called the American solution. It's quick, brutal, and effective. When you have to change, if you do the American solution, you do it quickly, brutally. Millions of white-collar workers have been unemployed, okay, or retired early. That's the expression, okay. One of the worst ones I've ever heard is RIP, okay, Retirement Incentive Plan, which also means rest in peace, okay. What a dumb thing. Okay, so we're interested in change, okay, and always we're looking for a better way to do things. And that's been true. It's been one of the constants in American history from the beginning of the nation to the present day. How long will it last? Well, I'm a historian, not a prophet, so I don't know, okay. That's for you to decide. Thank you. I will be happy to answer questions. Yes. Paul, our accountant, our only accountant, okay. Oh, yeah.
But you've identified these things that are, unique to our, or not, I guess not unique to our society, but are very important to American history. Does this have, in some way, shape a sort of national outlook or a national character?
I would say that's true. It's a hard concept to get a hold of, but I think we do have certain national values, and they're reflected, I think, in character. As long as you don't cram that down too hard over the whole society, okay, I think we lean toward certain kinds of values, in part because the system continues to reward those, okay? So we reward aggressive, okay, behavior. We award competitive behavior. We're not as interested as some other societies in cooperation. We're not as interested in effective regulation as some other societies. And again, you can put it on this four-cell framework, I think. We're not as interested in equity, okay? We're willing to tolerate. I don't sit around worrying that my president of my university is one of the 3 best paid in America. I don't know. I don't worry about that. Nor do I worry about the salaries that the baseball team makes or that other entertainers make. But I think you can put that in terms of American character when the situation changes, and if it changes over the long run. Let's say we had not made this last transition, the 3rd Industrial Revolution, and we were sinking. As we continue to sink, we get depressed, okay? This is when Jack Nicholson made his career in music, okay? He's the symbol of sardonic impotence, I think. And think of his movies, 5 Easy Pieces, go back over some of those you saw. You can get them out of Video American if you haven't seen them. Okay, but he became and Chinatown, probably some of you saw Chinatown. But when our society gets very depressed about these things and seems to be losing out, and the unemployment figures shoot up, and the society seems not to be working, then I think values will adjust, and then you can say character will adjust too. So I think that there will be changes, and I don't see character is not just set in stone. Okay, all of the Irish are not the same forever. It's dynamic. Okay, character changes too. Okay, yes. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yes. I think this is one of the major changes that's taking place right now. We're struggling. The last paper that I wrote and just delivered in Toronto was on a particular economic competitive policy and how it's being confronted by just that problem. And the question is, how do we regulate these entities? Because they clearly, if you are in a corporation and you don't think the corporation comes first, you are not going to be there. You're out. I have a good friend who's a very prominent and successful attorney, managing partner of a firm, and he gives the introductory talk to his new lawyers coming in. And the first thing he tells them is, you have a family, you have friends, you have a firm. If the firm doesn't come first, you'll never be partner. That's the first day, okay? Well, I think that's true in the corporation. If you don't place the corporation first, and I watch this, because I've been in some of these organizations over the years, and you watch people branch off when they make individual decisions. You decide, no, I don't want to be on the road 60% of my time. I would like to be with my family. I'd really like to meet my kids, okay? And you decide then to opt out, okay? And there'll be somebody who will take your place, generally, in the corporation. But the corporations are brutally self-centered. Now, that doesn't mean they won't achieve combinations with European firms. Oh no, they'll do that. They'll happily do that. And most of these are multinational. If you look at a great giant firm, one that you never think about, but you don't think about aluminum because you don't really care about it, except you want your car to run. But if you look at some great multinational corporation like Alcoa, they will go any place in the world to do business where they get cheap energy and cheap supplies, okay? And they are all over the world, okay? So in these great firms, they don't really care. And while they still have national offices, more and more, they don't really care about that terribly much, okay? Partly because a lot of their top executives are from several different countries, all right? And they're not wedded to one country. So it hasn't been too long ago that we had a great multinational threaten to leave Britain because of a regulatory policy. Well, I'll just go to the United States, they said. Okay, they won't do that, all right? So you're getting this happening, and it's probably going to happen more in the future. Okay, so you got right now a problem that you have no control at the level you're talking about, except a very informal forms of control. You have like the meetings of the G7, G8, G9, whatever it is, okay? You have transatlantic discussions that are going on constantly. You have policies that you've never heard of, okay, that are implemented by people you don't know the names of. There's a policy right now between the European Union and the United States called positive comity. I doubt that there's anyone in this room that's ever heard the expression positive comity or would have any idea what it means, okay? But it now is invoked against these giant multinational corporations day by day, okay? So these things are happening, all right? But if you're saying there's no consolidation of control at the top level, the global level, that's true. That's true. So we're in a curious period of transition in that regard. Yes, Don. Incidentally, even though running the Eisenhower project was like running say, a large hamburger stand. It was not complex like a multinational corporation. I took my own concept of how it should run from those corporations, and so when I was handling the external relations, there was one person who was running it on a day-to-day basis for many years, and then became co-editor with me and made sure that the thing got finished, and that's Don Van A, who now works at the library and is about to ask me a stunning question. Okay.
Well, it sounds like as though you would agree with Eisenhower's Secretary of Defense, Charles A. Wilson. He said that what was good for General Motors was good for the USA and vice versa.
No, that's not true. My family never owned anything except a General Motors product until 1978. My family has not owned anything except a Japanese product since 1978. I wouldn't buy a General Motors product. And at that time, 1978, I did very careful comparative shopping, and the difference was 25% in quality for the same dollar. Okay? And since that time, I don't think the margin has gotten that much narrower. So, no, the answer is no. What's good for the United States is also good for China. I know because I shop in Toys R Us and Target, as we like to call it in Baltimore. I shop in those places, and everything's made in China. Everything I buy, okay? Because they grow up and they don't want them after a few months anyway, so, okay? No, that's not true. That's simply not true. That was rooted in a nationalistic concept of international competition. And I think we have moved beyond that, okay? We're drifting steadily toward very large units. The European Union, the Western Hemisphere, and ultimately Asia will be, I think, the large regional units that we're going to have in our societies. And we can't think nationally. That reflected national thinking, you see. So no, I want to be able to buy a Honda myself. Yes. Yes, yes. I tell you what, fundamentally, Don can correct me on this, and he probably could, but I think Eisenhower's major concern was the whole world in the 1950s was drifting toward state-owned enterprise. We forget that Italy at that time had, next to the Soviet Union, the largest state-owned enterprise sector in its economy in the world. Italy, our friend in NATO, Italy. Okay? Now, we were very nervous at that time that all these countries were going to vote communist governments in democracy, because we were, on the one hand, we believed in democracy. On the other hand, we wanted them to be our friends and our, and I quote, trading partners. Okay? Eisenhower was very worried that we weren't going to have any trading partners. Okay? And that we were in a system in which these nationally controlled entities, okay, would be in competition with us in that way. So he saw the whole world drifting in that direction and wanted to stop that drift. It seems to me that was a major goal. And so that was what he was worried about. So it was not so much that he was not so much worried about whether businesses would behave. He was worried about the drift that was taking place, both domestically and in international relations. Okay? Yes. That light is awful.
You're talking about this kind of quick and brutal American system.
Yeah.
Cutthroat American corporations and law firms. And I was just curious in your research if you've noticed if European business culture is starting to reflect some of that same attitude, or are they keeping with their own kind of culture?
They're changing. The European system is under tremendous pressure. Every country in Europe is under pressure. One of my favorites is Tony Blair. I like Tony Blair, and particularly because he says things that are really memorable and interesting. And if you read Tony Blair's statements about competition in the competitive world, okay, they could be taken right out of Joseph Schumpeter, the great analyst of entrepreneurship. Tony Blair wants Great Britain to be just like he's looking over his shoulder, not at Japan, but at the United States. And he says, we've got to be more like them. And that's what he's saying. It's in print. You can read it, okay? And even though, and what's stunning is that he's the head of a labor government, okay? And he made this accommodation, partly to be reelected. One of my favorite quotations out of those elections was by The Guardian. I love The Guardian because they actually say memorable things. And one of the things they said about Tony Blair said that the crocodile appears to be smiling, but it's just the physical effect of its muscles. It said, much like Tony Blair. Okay. The Guardian hated it when he was leaving the left behind, okay, both to be reelected and to try to remake the British position. So they're under tremendous pressure. They're under tremendous pressure on immigration. And you watch Germany's struggles in the recent past to deal with immigration. If you do a comparative study, there are two ways in which I think the American system is ahead in both in terms of equity and in terms of innovation. And one is our acceptance of immigrants and the manner in which we have now built our software engineering, our national software engineering system on the backs of Indian software engineers, some of which now we outsource. So we have shifted very quickly in that regard, and we are much more open to immigration. We have also done a much better job of incorporating women, it seems to me, into this structure of power. I'm trying to, I will be happy if you'll correct me so I don't make this mistake again, but I cannot imagine a woman holding the position of CEO of Hewlett-Packard in any country except the United States right now. I can see it in government positions, but not in the private sector. And she's not alone, or she's no longer there. Okay, she'll be back, believe me. She's a very impressive woman. When I meet people, a woman, I met recently a woman major general in the Marines, okay? It seems to me that we're making, if you're thinking about an economy, and you said to yourself, well, is an economy better off if it makes good use of 50% of the population? Well, yes, of course. Okay, so I think we're adjusting to that in a faster and a better way, and also we absorb minorities, I think, into the system now in a better and more effective way. It's not easy, okay, and if I'm right about regionalization and about the Western Hemisphere, I don't like to say this because I don't want us to do anything that will upset it. Okay, I want it to go on. I want the free trade area of America to be extended, but there's going to be an enormous wave of immigration. Okay, so I tell my students, learn Spanish right now. Okay, learn it well. Don't just get by the language requirements. Okay. So.
As I look at your quadrant,
That's right.
So I think business has one function.
That's right.
Government probably has another function. I don't know whether
they overlap, but you're right.
Whether there's a third one somehow, consumers, or how would you divide the functions that work to create the balance?
Well, we have, it seems to me, three major sectors in our society, and one is the public sector, which has grown steadily since I pointed out the late 19th century. It began to grow, and it's grown steadily since that time. It continues to grow, okay, as a percentage of our whole economy. Then we have a very strong private sector, okay, private for-profit organizations. And then we have one thing that doesn't exist in Europe to the same extent, which is a nonprofit sector. We have an enormous nonprofit sector. And it seems to me that they perform overlapping but somewhat different functions. Among the nonprofits, universities train people, universities produce basic research. Universities generally in the past have not done applied research and applied things to the development of the economy. Businesses generally will do that, will draw on universities for people, so they interact all of the time, but they perform somewhat different functions. The government, it seems to me, the great function of the government is to sort of preside over that balance. And for instance, taxation policy can have a tremendous impact on that balance, okay? And the way we use fiscal policy in our society, the way we regulate in our society. We've had a current wave of reaction negative to regulation against particular kinds of experiments with regulation. But it isn't that we want to get rid of regulation entirely. We want to change it. We want it to be more efficient. We're experimenting. We're experimenting with competition markets in utilities, for instance, where we normally have had regulation. And so there's a constant flow between these. They perform basically different functions, though, it seems to me. And I'm not talking about things like national security. Obviously, the government has primary responsibility for that, but there are tremendous spillovers between these sections, so that when we develop computers for national security purposes, that has an impact on the private sector. When we developed something that you, again, have never thought about, we don't think about these things, but we developed rockets for national defense, and we had to fill them with liquid gases. Well, that spawned a tremendous liquid gas industry, okay, with tremendous implications for the economy. And we don't think about these interactions. These are going on all of the time between these sectors, okay? Some of them are good, some of them are bad. We read about the bad ones, okay? Recently, we've read about some bad ones in Congress, okay? But on balance, it is a question of whether the system works, to my mind. That's very important. And going back to Paul's question about character and the way we feel about ourselves and what we are. So yes, they perform different functions, they overlap in many cases, and they interact in a very important way. Now, I'm not just because my daughter is a lawyer, but a lot of these compromises are worked out by attorneys in government and outside of government. They work out the compromises, okay? I once interviewed a very good antitrust attorney. He'd been assistant attorney general for antitrust, and he said, oh, well, he said that I thought like a historian or an academic. And he said, you got to think like a lawyer, he said. Now, it may be obvious to you that Tuesday follows Monday, okay? But to a lawyer, it could be the day between Monday and Wednesday. It doesn't have to be Tuesday, okay? I can say that in a whole lot of different ways, he said, and I will, all right? But all of that chopping and tuning, a lot of that is negotiated by people for whom negotiation is a way of life, okay? And I think we're better off as a result of that over the long run if we look at how the system works. I like our system of democracy. I think even though it's skewed in many ways, and it gets warped in many ways, and we have all kinds of scandals in our system, I think in the long run it works. We got a good question over here. I've been waiting for this one from Maurice. Yes.
My question has to do with what you putting together in the idea of civil society.
Yes. Yes.
And how do you explain this? I'll give you 3 examples.
How do I explain what?
I'll give you 3 examples.
Okay. All right.
You put them together.
Okay.
You have the president of the World Bank.
Yeah.
Who's developing a certain policy around Iraq and things like that. And I get the idea that if he saw a man starving on the street, he probably would stop and give him a nickel. And that's just my idea. You go
Okay.
to the doctor, you pay him good money, but you leave and you really don't think that he really cares about your health.
Yeah.
Then you go to the coffee shop and the
Yeah.
person throws the change at you. So you have it at all these different levels of society.
Now, what does the person in the coffee shop do?
Go to the coffee shop and pay your money to get a cup of coffee, and the person is so frustrated with their job, they throw the change at you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You have instability at all those, to me.
Yeah.
All those levels. You have your efficiency, you have this, you have your profit, but all that at a
Yeah.
certain cost for people at all levels.
Yeah.
So as great as it is or may be, something is really lacking. And how
Well, my own view of that is that we have never been a very civil society, okay? We have not been terribly good at that. And if you look back, I was raised in the Middle West, out in the country, and it was kind of rough and not very civil. There were sort of small town and agrarian controls on personal behavior. It was very intrusive society, wanted to know what everyone was doing all the time, which is why a lot of people fled to Chicago or Indianapolis if they couldn't get to Chicago. But I don't know that we have ever been a very civil society. Now, whether it's breaking down more in the recent past as a result of urbanization and economic change, I'm not certain. I'm not certain. I don't think it's breaking down in the sense of sort of the larger sense of the way we control our society or run our society, but in these personal interactions, I'll go back to, let's start with the World Bank. The World Bank is an institution that's lost its function. We have a World Bank representative here, a man who spent 20 years, was it 20? 25 years at the World Bank. The World Bank is here in Washington for a reason. Because we were the dominant world power, economically, militarily, and every other way, okay, at that time. So they built the headquarters here. All the presidents of the World Bank have been Americans, okay? Now that, to me, is much more of a problem than the current function of the World Bank. That and the fact that the World Bank, that the world economy has passed the World Bank by, and the World Bank has been struggling for about 20 years to try to find a function. I would like it to find some, and we're back to your question, I'd like to find a real function in the world economy in terms of financial flows, the World Bank and the IMF. But right now, it is incapable of dealing with that. To me, I'm a systems man, and that's the most important problem, not the current president. He will struggle. The last president, Wolfenson, put out a new journal. You'll love this. When he came in, he knew something had to change because the World Bank was being attacked from the left and the right. That's really bad, okay? The environmentalists were attacking the World Bank and the conservatives were attacking the World Bank because it dealt with governments, okay? And so he knew that he had to have a new kind of organization. So he began to put out a journal called Change, okay? Innovation, Change, all right? And tried to inspire the troops. It didn't work very well, okay? And the World Bank is still struggling. That, to my mind, is more important than whether, when he gets into that deep World Bank bureaucracy, which runs in a very special way because it's truly international and deeply controlled by the countries that send representatives to it, then I think he'll have a lot of problems with that. His behavior will be controlled. So I'm not concerned that he's heartless, okay, or that he wants to exercise American power. The IMF was quite proud of a regime change recently, and I think that's unfortunate, okay? And I think that I think both the IMF and the World Bank need change, need reform, okay? So I would like to see them changed in certain decisive ways, and that I really consider important. Now, the person in the store who throws their money across the counter at you, they don't get a tip. Myself, I think that's my response, is that they don't get a tip. And if I really felt badly about it, I'd take, they have a little tag on there that says their name, and I would report them to the manager. Okay, I do that sometimes, okay?
But I'm just using that person.
Yes, as a...
Saying the person at the bottom reflects the person that, it goes from the bottom to the top. And it used to be that it was just the top, but now such things have infected society so much, it's everywhere.
Well, what I call the American solution has pervaded the society. I would agree with that. That is that this attitude that we have to do things in the most efficient, the fastest way and get it done and get on with it because something's coming right behind you, you know, Satchel Paige's thing. Don't look back, they may be catching up. And I think there is that sense throughout the society, and that works against what you want, which is a sort of a sense of controls of civil behavior. I think it works against that, just like the American solution did. Just like the changes that are taking place in retirement throughout America, okay? They're being done hard, fast, and to the detriment of large numbers of people. Okay? So, yes, the answer is yes. Okay.
I think we should give our thanks to Lou Galambos. This has been quite very wonderful and stimulating. The conversation can continue at the back of the room. Under the tablecloths, we have a buffet. So I will remove the tablecloths and please enjoy lunch. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.